The Great Spears are going to be the last of the poking attack types weapon classes that I do cover, and these are actually going to be really good and probably one of the better ones at that. Obviously, the fact that these are poking attack types weapons means that they're doing piercing damage, and typically poking attacks tend to hit at further distances and come out pretty fast. Now for the Great Spears, they're going to be the slowest of the bunch, but they're typically going to have the most range, obviously hit the hardest, do some nice stance damage. Their one-handed options pair very nicely with a shield. Two-handed, they're going to be very good. Even power stance, they perform very well. Being that these movesets actually hit simultaneously, it can actually output a lot of damage. They probably also have the best crouching attack power stance combo in the game as well. And being that there's lots of different buffs as of the DLC that actually boost your rolling or crouching attack damage, just making a build just centered around this can be viable. Now, Great Spears also do get a plethora of really good weapon skill options, being that they actually do have poking attacks and have access to polearm types of skills. There's lots of amazing options out there. Now, unfortunately for the infusible Great Spears, the Sword Lance exists, and this kind of just outclasses them in almost every single way. The Sword Lance is a heavy thrusting sword, but it gets the same heavy attack moveset as the Great Spears, and it literally just gets more damage as well. Like, the Sword Lance can straight up outdamage every single one with almost every single infusion. Now, there are going to be some cases to where you would rather want to use the Great Spears, but if you wanted to go with like an Impaling Thrust build or a Guard counter build, the Sword Lance is probably just going to do those things better. But for today, we are going to rank all 10 of them from worst to best based on how well they perform and how useful they are in just for PvE. Starting off at the bottom, the BLOODFIEND'S Sacred Spear, which is one of the new ones from the DLC. Now, this weapon is obviously very comparable to the MOHGWYN'S Sacred Spear, and yes, for the most part, it is going to be directly outclassed by it, but it does have some few things going for it and some things that just make it completely terrible. Now, the MOHGWYN'S Sacred Spear does actually get more range, can get it earlier in the game, and it just gets the much better skill, as I will get into, but the BLOODFIEND'S Sacred Spear does actually get much more bleed build-up. Like, its higher amounts of arcane, this thing can get over 120 bleed, whereas for the MOHGWYN'S Spear, it only gets about 90 bleed build-up, and also the BLOODFIEND'S gets a better arcane scaling. So with a pure arcane build at higher levels, this thing can just hit harder as well. Now, MOHGWYN'S does get a better strength scaling, so when going into strength and arcane, that one is going to be the better option. And despite its bleed build-up being pretty good, a bleed-infused MESSMER Soldier Spear or a bleed-infused Sword Lance are still just going to get higher amounts of bleed. But the fact that this thing is just for an arcane build is going to be very useful. Now, another annoying thing about the weapon is that for some reason, it just gets less stance damage compared to all the other Great Spears. Like, with every single attack, it just gets lower amounts for some reason. Like, the charged heavy attacks do just as much as a regular spear. I don't know why that's the case. Maybe it's because it's like the lightest Great Spear in the entire game, but that definitely is a downside. So for me, I think the only purpose of this weapon is to be power stance alongside the MOHGWYN'S Sacred Spear. For whatever reason, if you actually wanted to have it power stanced, this is going to be the only other option because you can only get one of these per playthrough. But outside of that, I wouldn't care to use it because its skill is just awful. It is like a very similar version of the MOHGWYN'S Sacred Spear, but the difference is that this one actually does travel in a further distance. It actually like shoots out the AoE instead of surrounding the player, but the AoE is like 5 times as small, does way less damage, it staggers basically nothing, and it does much worse bleed build-up for the exact same FP cost. Like, the skill is just useless. Like, you're just better off using the MOHGWYN'S Spear instead. Number 9, the VYKE'S War Spear, which this weapon is definitely meant and built for PvP due to its madness properties, and madness unfortunately does basically nothing in PvE outside of fighting NPCs, which are a lot of NPCs, especially in the DLC, so it does have some uses. But for the most part, I still wouldn't really care for it because it is going to be the shortest Great Spear in the entire game, and it gets the worst damage as well. Like, the base damage is very low, does get like an okay dexterity and faith-based scaling, but basically every other Great Spear can just get more damage than this and just get more range. It does get a horizontal swiping heavy attack, which can be good for variation. Now, unfortunately, this horizontal swipe does actually get less motion values, meaning it's going to get less damage than like the regular poking attack heavy. But having more variety is pretty cool. But the main reason why it is going to get lower on the list is because its skill is just borderline useless. It does serve as like this fire-based AoE attack, and this fire AoE just does very mediocre damage and like a somewhat long animation. It actually does shoot out the AoE as well, so it actually can serve as like a little bit of a projectile attack, but the damage is just not that good. And also against like a lot of larger types of bosses, the skill can just straight up bug out to where the explosion just doesn't even occur, and you're missing out on like 90% of your damage, so the thing is just basically useless. Like, this weapon skills always work like this. It's always been bugged. I don't know why they haven't fixed it at all. Mainly because it is a PvP weapon, and in PvP it works perfectly fine and it's not bugged. But in PvE, like, it's just kind of shit. Number 8, the TREESPEAR. Now, if this weapon could be infused, it would just be an S tier option because it gets an amazing heavy attack. But thankfully, they actually did make an infusible version of this in the DLC, in the MESSMER Soldier Spear. Like, this weapon gets the exact same heavy attack, but it can be infused, so that one is just going to be the direct upgrade. But that's not to say that this one is actually useless, because this one can be acquired very early on in the game. It does get a dexterity and faith-based scaling. It does go primarily off that dexterity stat. Unfortunately, it does require smithing stones and cannot be infused. and it just gets stuck with a non-unique skill, and this non-unique skill is Sacred Order, which is like a weapon buff to help you get more damage for potentially those really good charged heavy attacks, as they do just hit multiple times. And this definitely is the best charged heavy attack for the Great Spears, and some of the best in the entire game. But another funny thing about this weapon is that you can buff it as well, and the Sacred Order skill overrides your weapon buff. So it's like kind of counterintuitive to even have this thing as a skill, and you're just always going to be better off just using like a regular weapon buff. Probably just throwing on things like Order's Blade, because it already does get some split holy damage, is just probably going to be better. Like I would have rather this thing have basically any other skill but this one. Like it does serve as like a nice early game option to have Sacred Blade if you wanted to kill those death birds, but if you are just using the weapon itself, it would have been nice if this thing had like any different type of damaging skill. Number 7, the Spear of the Impaler, which this thing can actually be like one of the best weapons to use, and sometimes it can just be one of the worst things to use. So I think it kind of just balances out to like be a solid B tier. The weapon does get very respectable range, very decent damage, does get very similar scalings to the VYKE'S War Spear, but it can just hit harder due to its higher base damage. It does actually get a very high dexterity requirements, but being that you do access it in the DLC, not going to be that big of a deal. But in terms of its weapon skill, Mesmer's Assault, it can be one of the highest damaging skills in the entire game. Like hitting with this entire combo can just shred everything, and it doesn't really consume much FP in doing so. Now the problem is with this skill is that it's such a long animation that a lot of bosses, especially in the DLC, are just not going to let you get the combo off. They're either going to stagger you out of it, or you're just going to take so much damage that you're just not going to win that trade. Now when you're fighting like enemies that can be staggered and that are going to let you get the attack off, this thing can just be utterly devastating. So typically when you're using a skill like this and fighting enemies that actually give you smaller openings, you probably want to be able to just use your charged heavy attacks instead. But the thing is, this weapon's charged heavy attack is just useless. It sucks so bad. It is going to be a heavy projectile attack, which means it's not going to consume any FP, but the trade-off being is that it does terrible damage, consumes your entire stamina bar, does awful stance damage, and it's just a complete waste of time. Like charged heavy attacks are typically going to be your best way to proc stance breaks, especially with really large weapons like this, but this thing only gets 8 stance damage on a fully charged heavy attack, which is just awful, and you're doing like so much less damage as well. Like it is nice to have it as a projectile option, but typically you're going to pair this alongside a faith build anyway, so you actually are going to have some projectile options already accessible, and your skill actually kind of does serve as a projectile as well. Like the first part of it actually does go out pretty far. A lot of people don't really like see how far the projectile does go, but I would just use this instead, because yeah, this heavy attack is just terrible. If it was just like a regular normal poking heavy attack, I would put this weapon into the A tier. Number 6, the Barbed Staff Spear. Now this weapon is basically just like a pure faith type of great spear, does some split holy damage, and it's going all into faith can actually net you a decent amount. Like compared to all the other types of faith based spears, this one can just out damage them with these pure faith builds. And on top of all that, it actually does get passive bleed. It is only 55 bleed build up, and with a great spear, it's probably not going to proc it as fast, but just having the ability to potentially like just proc bleed once in a boss fight is obviously going to be really good. It also does get the same heavy attack as the VYKE'S War Spear in the SILURIA'S tree, and that nice horizontal swipe, which as I mentioned does do a little bit less damage, but just having the variety is there. Now thankfully this weapon does have a really good skill that complements the weapon perfectly, which is going to be a really nice projectile, really easy to use, comes out very fast, and also does do a decent amount of damage. I feel like it could have been a bit more damage, especially with how much FP that it does cost, which is about like 6 FP for every single tick. So when you're holding onto it for a few seconds, it ends up consuming about 30 FP. And sometimes it feels like the damage is just not enough. Like it shoots out all these like holy projectiles, but half of them just straight up miss. I don't know what it is, but it only hits with like 1 or 2 for every like 5 projectiles that you shoot out. It still is viable damage, but I did wish it was more. But thankfully it actually also does proc bleed as well. It probably is just a bug and it's always worked like this, but it actually does do a little bit of bleed build up. When you are holding onto it for a few seconds and consume about 30 FP, it does do roughly 100 bleed build up, which is definitely not much. But if you are in the middle of a boss fight, you can definitely proc bleed at least once with this thing. So yeah, overall, I think it's just a great weapon. It gets a good fade scaling, you get access to bleed, it's a nice projectile attack that's easy to use and goes pretty far. It's a solid A tier. Number 5, the Lance, which actually is the lone infusible spear in the entire base game. And the fact that it is the only one that you can acquire in the base game is just going to make it very useful, because great spears are a nice weapon class and they get access to a bunch of different really cool unique skills. And being that this weapon class actually does get the most amount of stance damage compared to all the other different types of poking attack weapon classes, it probably just makes for the best pairing alongside with them. For things like Impaling Thrust, Spectral Lance, Piercing Fang, the Lance is probably going to be like the best pairing for those types of weapons. Now, unfortunately, once you get to the DLC, this thing is going to be directly outclassed by things like the Sword Lance and the MESSMER Soldier Spear. The MESSMER Soldier Spear is basically just another great spear that can be infused, but you can farm it, means you actually can get multiple of them, and it actually is just going to get more damage with basically every infusion and get you the better heavy attack as well. So yes, it is ultimately outclassed, but you definitely can do the entire base game before you even go into the DLC, and the lance can just carry you from start to finish. At number 4, the Serpent-Hunter, which this weapon does get probably the best moveset out of all the great spears in my opinion, and it is going to be another weapon that performs very well in the base game, and it is a very popular level 1 option as it doesn't have any requirements. Now this is a weapon that cannot be infused and does only get a strength-based scaling, so you definitely are limited in build creation with this thing, but you still are going to benefit off amazing damage and a really good moveset. It does get you the poking or crouching rolling attack, which these attacks come out very fast and still do some decent damage. It does get a really cool jumping heavy attack as it slams with like the entire length of the weapon, which typically for great spears I only get like a small little poke and which doesn't really get much range. And it also does get the horizontal swiping heavy attack. So the entire moveset just has very good variation. Now with this charged heavy attack, it is going to be very similar to like the SILURIA'S tree, the VYKE'S war spear, and the barbed star spear. And with those weapons, they actually get less motion values with their heavy attacks. But for some reason with the Serpent-Hunter, it actually gets boosted motion values. So this thing can make for one of the best charge attack types weapons in the entire game. The heavy attack does come out faster than the other heavy attacks, and it just does way more damage. And with charged heavy attacks, they're actually very easy to build around, being that all the items that you need for them are very early on in the game. And even if you don't have an opening long enough for a charged heavy, you're still going to have a good poking attack moveset as well. Now, I think the most unfortunate part about the weapon is probably going to be its skill. The skill actually isn't bad by any means. It is like a very, very long animation that doesn't really have much range. So you're probably going to get hit almost every single time that you use it. But the damage is actually very good. It does obviously do piercing damage, and it actually does a decent amount of stance damage too. Now, typically just going with a regular charged heavy attack build is just going to result in this like higher DPS, and it's more consistency, less stamina cost, and probably just more stance damage quicker as well. I would have liked for this weapon skill to retain somewhat of a projectile attack, kind of like how it can be used in the boss fights. Obviously not have anywhere near as much range, but at least like extend the weapon by like a few times the amount. It would have been nice. If that was the case, I probably would have put this weapon into the S tier, but it still is definitely deserving of an A tier. Number 3, the SILURIA'S tree, a strength faith-based holy weapon. Does actually scale better off the strength stat more so than the faith stat, but going either or can just be perfectly fine. If you actually wanted to utilize more spells, you can just go all into faith and you can still get some very viable damage. The weapon does get like the regular great spear moveset, but with the horizontal swiping heavy, just like most of the other faith-based spears. Like there are 10 great spears in this game and 5 of them scale of faith for some reason. Don't know why we didn't get a cool like intelligence great spear. Don't know why we didn't get a faith-based katana, but we're not going to get into that. But yes, this weapon is actually really good, mainly because of its skill, SILURIA'S Woe. For 25 FP, it does do this like little short-range AoE attack, and it's definitely not really much damage, and it's not really worth the 25 FP. But when you have it fully charged, it definitely is, because it turns it into like this massive projectile attack that goes very far, has a wide AoE, can hit multiple enemies at once, and just do a decent amount of damage, especially if you pair it alongside things like the Godfrey's icon. And best of all yet, the weapon actually does scale off AR, so going into either strength or faith is going to help boost the damage. And as I always mention, projectile attacks can just cheese the game, and this one can just go incredibly far. You don't have to engage with an enemy, you just sit further back and just keep spamming the skill and everything's dying. But even if you do end up getting in these close range engagements, it's going to be a weapon with a good moveset and some good damage. Like you can't really go wrong. Number 2, the MESSMER's Soldier Spear. Now, as I mentioned with the Lance, this is just going to be the upgraded version of that, as it is going to be the only other infusible great spear in this game, this one just being in the DLC. So basically, once you get to the DLC, you just switch to this one because it just gets more damage, basically the exact same range, requirements, weight, and the better heavy attack too, which is going to be the best thing about it. It does get the same heavy attack as the TREESPEAR with this cool double poke, which this double poking attack isn't really that much slower than like a regular poking attack, but it's just going to get way more damage. So speccing into a charged heavy attack build, this thing can just be ridiculous, whether you're pairing it alongside Roll Nut Resolve, Crag Blade, you're just going to be destroying everything. Now, if you're going to be using this thing outside of a charged heavy attack build, unfortunately, it is going to be outclassed by the Sword Lance, because the Sword Lance does just do more damage. So if you actually wanted to go with like a weapon skill spamming build with some poking attack skills, or going with a guard countering build, that one is just going to be the better option. But being that this weapon does fall under the Great Spear weapon category, you are going to get access to some more different types of skills, like Spectral Lance. This weapon is the best pairing alongside that skill. And also, if you did want to power stance great spears, you could just have this one as an offhand option because it is infusible. You could make this thing like strength infused or faith infused and pair it alongside anything else, and it could do its job that way as well. It's a weapon that gets good damage, good scalings with basically every infusion, and just an amazing moveset. At number 1, the MOHGWYN'S Sacred Spear. I'm sure to nobody's surprise, yes, this weapon did get nerfed as of the DLC releasing. The AoE does actually get a lot less blood loss build up now. And to make sure that I actually wasn't tripping at still putting this thing at number 1, I made sure to do a run with it recently, only using the weapon skill, and it straight up just destroyed everything. the weapon is still amazing. It gets the most range in class, gets really good scalings, obviously gets that passive bleed build up, and the weapon skill is just OP. It just has like this massive AoE attack that can hit any enemy surrounding them. It stun locks them all, does amazing damage, good bleed build up, actually can do some okay amount of stance damage as well, especially if you hit with the entire combo, which does consume 60 FP, but it definitely is worth it. Like the damage is just ridiculously high. It might not be like the best skill to use against like certain types of bosses that don't really give you like these longer openings, but it still can be a weapon that you can trade out with. But when it does come to fighting like trash mobs or going through legacy dungeons, there's like quite literally nothing better than this AoE attack. It's just like so easy to use and it just kills everything instantly. Anyway, that's now done and completed. As always, let me know what your opinions are down in the comments below. The next weapon is going to be the halberds. That is just next on the list, and we're just going to keep going down. We're almost done. But yeah, there are a lot of halberds, so that will definitely be a longer type of video. So definitely do subscribe for that. Anyway, catch you guys around. Bye.